When we speak of French Indochina, it is easy to imagine a single unified colony. However, this was never the reality. The French Indochinese Union, officially created in 1887, was a patchwork of different territories governed in distinct ways. It was an administrative construction designed more for Paris's convenience than for the people living there. The Union brought together Vietnam, Cambodia, and later, Laos, under a single governor-general. But on the ground, the experiences of the Vietnamese, Khmer, and Lao peoples under French authority were vastly different. This uneven approach to governance was not accidental. It was a deliberate strategy, shaped by the perceived value and strategic importance of each territory. The French saw their Indo-Chinese possessions through a clear hierarchy. At the top was Vietnam, the economic engine and administrative center of the entire project. Below it was Cambodia, valued primarily as a strategic buffer zone and for its ancient cultural prestige. At the very bottom was Laos, a remote and sparsely populated land that was largely ignored. This tiered system of rule meant that French investment, infrastructure development, and political control were concentrated heavily in one area while others were left to stagnate. Understanding this unequal framework is essential to grasping why each territory followed such a different path toward independence and modernity. The legal and political structures reflected this hierarchy perfectly. Vietnam itself was carved into three separate regions to break its unity. Cochinchina in the south was a direct colony. Annam in the center, and Tonkin in the north were protectorates, at least in name. Cambodia and Laos were also protectorates, meaning their monarchies were officially left in place, though real power rested with French officials. This complex system allowed the French to apply different laws, taxes, and levels of force depending on their local objectives. They did not build a nation. They managed a portfolio of assets, each with its own balance sheet of costs and benefits. This administrative division had profound and lasting consequences for the peoples of the region. It created separate political trajectories and fostered distinct identities that often worked against a sense of regional solidarity. While a Vietnamese intellectual in Hanoi might be educated in a French-style lyceum and join a nationalist movement, a rural farmer in Laos might barely encounter a French official in his entire lifetime. The colonial experience was not monolithic. It was a fragmented reality, and these fragments would later form the building blocks of the independent and often conflicted nations of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. The seeds of future conflicts were sown in this deliberate policy of divide and rule. Vietnam was, without question, the crown jewel of French Indochina. For the French, its value was primarily economic. The fertile Mekong Delta in the south and the Red River Delta in the north were transformed into vast plantations for producing rice and rubber for the global market. French investors and companies poured capital into these ventures, extracting immense wealth from the land and the labor of the Vietnamese people. To support this exploitation, the French built significant infrastructure, but only where it served their interests. Railways, ports, and roads were constructed to move raw materials out of the country efficiently, not to connect Vietnamese communities or foster internal development. This intense economic focus required a firm political grip. The French dismantled the authority of the Nguyen emperors, dividing Vietnam to weaken any sense of a unified national identity. In Cochinchina, they ruled directly, imposing French laws and creating a class of landowners who collaborated with the colonial regime. In Annam and Tonkin, they ruled indirectly through a weakened imperial court, but French residents and administrators held the real power. This direct and oppressive control, combined with heavy taxes and the state monopolies on salt, alcohol, and opium, created deep resentment among the Vietnamese population, from peasants to the educated elite. The concentration of French power and investment in Vietnam also led to the rise of a powerful and organized nationalist movement. Unlike in Cambodia or Laos, the Vietnamese had a long history of resisting foreign domination, particularly from China. The French presence, with its blend of economic exploitation and cultural imposition, ignited this spirit of resistance. Educated in French schools but denied real opportunities, a new generation of Vietnamese intellectuals and activists began to organize. They formed political parties and secret societies, inspired by both Western ideas of self-determination and communist ideologies, all aimed at one goal: expelling the French. By the early 20th century, Vietnamese society was a hotbed of anti-colonial activity. From Phan Boi Chau's monarchist restoration movements to Ho Chi Minh's Indochinese Communist Party, the struggle for independence was sophisticated, widespread, and persistent. The French responded with brutal repression, using their secret police, prisons like Pulo Condor, and military force to crush dissent. However, this only hardened the resolve of the nationalists. Vietnam was not just the economic center of the French Empire in Asia. It also became the epicenter of resistance against it, setting the stage for decades of violent conflict. Cambodia's role within French Indochina was fundamentally different from Vietnam's. The French saw Cambodia not as a source of great wealth, but as a crucial strategic buffer. It separated their valuable territories in Vietnam from British-influenced Siam, or what is now Thailand. To secure this buffer, the French established a protectorate in 1863, effectively saving the Cambodian monarchy from being completely absorbed by its more powerful neighbors, Siam and Vietnam. In return, the French took control of Cambodia's foreign policy and finances, leaving the king as a symbolic figurehead. This arrangement suited French interests perfectly, as it required minimal investment and administrative effort. The French approach to Cambodia was one of limited intervention and cultural preservation. Instead of building factories or large-scale plantations, they focused their attention on restoring the ancient temples of Angkor Wat. This project brought French archaeologists and scholars to Cambodia, and their work helped to resurrect a sense of Khmer cultural pride that had been diminished by centuries of foreign domination. However, this focus on the past came at the cost of the present. The French did little to develop Cambodia's economy, build modern schools, or train a local administrative class. Most bureaucratic positions were filled by Vietnamese officials brought in by the French, a policy that created lasting ethnic tensions. Laos was even more neglected than Cambodia. For the French, its primary value was as a vast, sparsely populated buffer zone between Vietnam and Siam. Acquired in 1893, the territory was remote, mountainous, and seen as having little economic potential. The French presence there was minimal, consisting of a handful of administrators, military officers, and missionaries. They made little effort to unify the three princely kingdoms of Luang Prabang, Vientiane, and Champasak that constituted the territory. The royal house of Luang Prabang was maintained, but French control was light and mostly confined to the main towns along the Mekong River. This policy of neglect meant that Laos remained one of the least developed regions in Asia. The French built almost no infrastructure, and education and healthcare were virtually non-existent outside of a few urban centers. The majority of the Lao population continued to live in subsistence farming villages, largely untouched by the colonial administration. While this meant they were spared the intense exploitation experienced by the Vietnamese, it also left them isolated and unprepared for the challenges of the 20th century. Laos entered the post-colonial era with a weak national identity, no trained leadership, and a society that had been deliberately kept in a state of arrested development. The uneven nature of French colonial rule created three vastly different societies by the mid-20th century. Vietnam, the center of French economic and political power, emerged with a relatively developed infrastructure, a highly politicized population, and a fierce, battle-hardened nationalist movement. Decades of resistance had forged a strong, albeit divided, sense of national purpose. In contrast, Cambodia's experience under a protectorate that preserved its monarchy and ancient culture left it with a weaker state apparatus and a political class that was less experienced in modern governance. Its development was symbolic rather than substantive, focused on the glories of the past. Laos stood as the most extreme example of colonial neglect. It was a state in name only, a loose collection of territories with no unifying infrastructure, educational system, or national consciousness. The French had used it as a geographical barrier and little more, leaving its people isolated from the modern world and from each other. This stark contrast between the three territories meant that when the French Empire finally crumbled after World War II, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were on entirely different footings. Vietnam was poised for a major war of independence, while Cambodia and Laos struggled to simply define what their nations were. These divergent colonial legacies profoundly shaped the post-colonial history of Southeast Asia. Vietnam's powerful military and nationalist drive, forged in the fight against the French, led it to not only defeat the United States, but also to intervene forcefully in its neighbors' affairs. The Vietnamese invasion of Cambodia in 1978, aimed at ousting the genocidal Khmer Rouge regime, was a direct consequence of this imbalance of power. The Khmer Rouge itself, with its radical, anti-modern ideology, can be seen in part as a violent reaction to a history of foreign domination and perceived Vietnamese expansionism, fears that were exacerbated during the colonial era. Ultimately, the French policy of divide and rule left a legacy of instability, suspicion, and conflict that plagued the region for decades after their departure. The borders they drew and the hierarchies they imposed created a foundation of inequality that made regional cooperation difficult. Vietnam's strength, Cambodia's vulnerability, and Laos's weakness were not preordained. They were the direct products of a colonial system that prioritized its own interests over the balanced development of the peoples it governed. The wars and revolutions that defined Indochina in the late 20th century were the final, tragic harvest of seeds planted a century earlier.